Hi everyone, I've just brought another video for you guys, so let's get started without further ado. Also, remember to like and comment. Tell me which manhwa you'd like me to cover next. Let's do this. XML one day, reality changed forever. The Yggdrasil tree suddenly appeared, growing to cover the entire world with its imposing presence. Physical existence merged with digital data. Countless game-based worlds were created, mixing cultures and altering the very structure of life. Humanity soon adapted to the new order. They christened that era the God's Game, where fantasy became everyday life. However, not everyone lived epic adventures. On a construction site, manual labor remained the only reality for some. The worker paused, removing his protective gear. Sweat and exhaustion were constant in that heavy and repetitive routine. An older colleague approached. Noticing the young man's fatigue, he touched his shoulder in a friendly gesture of support. The man smiled, trying to break the tension in the environment. He seemed to have good intentions and something important to deliver. He held out his hand, revealing a small, shiny chip. It was the payment, or perhaps a modest reward for the day's effort. The young man, however, acted hastily. He grabbed the item roughly and turned to leave, with no patience for pleasantries or conversation. As the young man disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, the older man remained there, visibly worried about that isolated and cold attitude. The protagonist moved forward, ignoring everything around him. His mind was focused only on what he would do next with what he had obtained. He walked through the city streets under the glow of the great tree. The divine light up above contrasted cruelly with the dark reality of the alleys where he lived. Without hesitation, he pushed the door open and entered. The promises of rare items and valuable prizes were an impossible temptation to resist. Inside, chaos reigned among desperate and bankrupt gamblers. The protagonist faced the machine, feeling the bitter taste of frustration at receiving only junk in return for his effort. The young man sat on the stool, his body tense. Anxiety made his hands tremble slightly as he waited. Before him, the interface of the random box machine glowed, offering the only chance to change that miserable fate. Sweat ran down the worker's face. He stared at the screen with a mixture of dread and desperate desire, knowing what was at stake. The system announced an increase in the chance of obtaining an SSR class item. It was the golden opportunity to get the account creation rights. He didn't hesitate. The young man pressed the start button, betting everything he had in the hope of a miracle. Beams of light cut through the virtual space, materializing the result of the bet with dizzying speed. However, reality was cruel. The system sarcastically congratulated him on acquiring a simple, ordinary toothbrush. He continued to spend his credits, but only junk accumulated around him. The day's pay turned into a pile of useless items. Once again, the light descended. Another box materialized, bringing with it a new wave of painful expectation. The cube spun in the air, descending slowly as the player's fate hung in the balance. The protagonist discarded the object angrily. Frustration and exhaustion were about to consume him completely. In that moment of despair, his mind froze. The sound of failure brought to the surface the reason for so much urgency. He was transported to a memory in the hospital. He remembered the moment he held the hand of someone who depended on him. His mother was there, fragile and connected to machines, but still forcing a smile so as not to worry her son. That memory dispelled the fatigue in an instant. The young man's eyes widened, burning with a renewed and insane determination. The machine reacted unexpectedly to the last bet. An overwhelming energy emanated from the console, indicating that something grand was about to happen. The young worker recoiled, stunned by the impact. That phenomenon was not common. It was the unmistakable sign of a prize he never imagined reaching. The accumulated energy shot upwards. Luck finally seemed to have smiled on him in his moment of greatest despair, breaking the cycle of failures. The object slowly materialized before him. It wasn't common junk, but a cube radiating an aura of extreme rarity, the ultimate prize. The protagonist stood paralyzed before the screen. His breath failed, and his entire body began to tremble with the sudden rush of adrenaline. He reached out with difficulty, fighting his own shock. The fear that it was just a hallucination made him hesitate before touching the prize. Emotion completely took over him. Tears streamed down his face as he realized that this item could finally be his mother's financial salvation. The revealed item was not a common weapon or equipment. It was an exclusive Yggdrasil identification card, the most coveted pass in the entire system. That card granted direct access to the labyrinth. It was the key to a dimension where the rules of the games applied to reality through avatars. However, its true value was even greater. That was the only existing means of materializing the treasures and powers of the labyrinth in the physical world. XML entire organizations dedicated their lives to studying this phenomenon. Scientists were trying to replicate the technology that was now, by chance, in the hands of a simple worker. Society had already been transformed by this power. Those who possessed it transcended common humanity, flying through the skies and performing miracles. It was a privilege reserved for a tiny and powerful elite. The young man had just earned the right to join this exclusive circle of wealth and influence. The euphoria propelled him into immediate action. He ran with all his might, eager to claim the new destiny that awaited him. Nothing could stop him now. The protagonist forged a path into the unknown, leaving his life of misery definitively behind. The young worker attempted a desperate escape, violently opening the door in the hope of escaping. However, his exit was immediately blocked. The impact threw him against the cold concrete floor. The young man's body, already exhausted, trembled with the brutal fall, leaving him vulnerable. The frustration burned more than the injuries. The protagonist gritted his teeth, facing the imminent threat while trying to process his sudden defeat. His pursuers mocked the situation, surrounding him like predators. For the group of aggressors, the debtor's luck had finally run out upon being captured. The young man's worst fear came true. One of the henchmen found the newly acquired item and promptly handed it over to his superior. Ignoring the victim's silent protests, the gang leader examined the object with interest. He immediately realized the value of that mysterious card that was now in his hands. The worker refused to give up his only hope. In a pathetic effort, he stretched out his arm and grabbed the man's leg, begging him to stop. The young man's audacity was met with pure contempt. The criminal looked down, visibly annoyed by the persistence of the one he considered a worm. The response was physical and merciless. The leader delivered a violent blow, using brute force to break free from the young man's desperate grip. The air escaped the protagonist's lungs with the impact. He writhed on the ground, feeling the sharp pain radiate throughout his body. The cruelty didn't stop there. The aggressor stepped firmly on the young man's hand, crushing his fingers against the rough asphalt. The leader applied more pressure, ensuring that the young man understood his position of submission through the excruciating pain. Then, the man grabbed the worker's hair tightly. He pulled the victim's head up, forcing him to face his tormentor. The leader approached with a sadistic and condescending smile. He taunted the injured young man, questioning his desire to live in anonymity. Then, the criminal did something unexpected. He pressed a finger against the protagonist's forehead, activating a strange energy that invaded the young man's mind. The brutal reality interrupted his momentary victory. The young man was violently pressed against the ground, his vision obscured by blood and digital interfaces that no one else could see. The gang leader grabbed his hair, forcing him to face defeat. There was no mercy in that look, only the contempt of someone collecting a debt by force. A brutal blow ended any attempt at resistance. The force of the impact made the young man's consciousness waver, plunging him into darkness. Even on the verge of fainting, his instincts refused to accept the end. The trembling hand sought support in the void, clinging to nothing but its own determination. The worker's body finally gave way, stretched out on the cold asphalt. For the aggressor, the job was done, and the lesson had been taught. The rain began to fall heavily, washing away the crime scene. The criminal, indifferent to the violence he had just committed, only complained about the weather and planned his next meal. The icy drops hit the young man's outstretched hand. The cold should have kept him on the ground, but it only served to awaken something dormant within him. The group walked away, believing they had left behind only an unconscious debtor. However, the atmosphere changed, causing one of the henchmen to hesitate and look back. A movement in the alley caught their attention. The leader and his subordinate turned around, incredulous to realize that the victim was still moving. Against all physical odds, the young man rose. His body swayed, trembling and exhausted, driven by a willpower that bordered on madness. The system warned of his critical condition, demanding immediate medical attention. The worker, however, ignored the danger warnings, his eyes fixed on a single objective. Dragging his feet, he advanced. It didn't matter the excruciating pain or the alerts flashing in his mind. The need to continue outweighed his survival instinct. The aggressor snapped his fingers, visibly annoyed. The persistence of that pathetic victim insulted his authority, and he seemed ready to use violence again. To the total shock of the criminals, the young man was not seeking revenge or escape. He walked straight to the random box store, ignoring the presence of his tormentors. Each step left a red trail on the wet asphalt. Addiction and despair drove him, transforming his physical pain into fuel for another bet. The gang leader questioned his own sanity upon seeing the victim move. That debtor should be dead. System alerts flashed incessantly about the imminent failure of vital organs. The young worker, however, ignored the proximity of death. The only reality that his fractured mind could process was the agonizing pain that consumed his entire being. Amidst the delirium, memories of ordinary days and conversations with the older colleague flooded his thoughts. He ignored the criminals and dragged his broken body towards the objective. The gang, stunned, simply watched that impossible march. Each movement demanded superhuman effort. The boy fought against gravity itself to keep moving forward. His body, however, finally reached its limit. The protagonist collapsed before the machine, unable to stay on his feet. Even on the ground, giving up wasn't an option. He raised a trembling hand, driven by pure desperation. With a final breath of determination, the young man touched the luminous screen. The final bet was made. His vision began to fail rapidly. The real world seemed to dissolve before him. Exhaustion took its toll, forcing him to close his eyes as consciousness faded into darkness. Suddenly, a divine light broke through the rainy night. The manifestation of a golden tree emerged with overwhelming power. The gang leader recoiled, blinded by the intense glow. This was completely beyond his understanding. The worker was bathed in a pillar of pure energy, being isolated from the cruel reality of that alley. The protocol initiated forced conversion. The system demanded a name for the rebirth of the one who refused to die. The young man awoke in a silent void, before a solitary pulpit. He questioned if this absolute darkness would finally be the other side of life. Looking at his own hands, he realized he was handcuffed. Before he could understand the situation, a voice demanded that he register his character's name. The worker panicked, shouting that it was all nonsense. He protested vehemently, insisting that he was not to blame for anything that was happening. However, his voice failed when he noticed strange presences appearing behind him. The system ignored his fear and began to introduce itself. A solemn message echoed in the void, congratulating him. The system announced the beginning of a new existence and the obtaining of a unique rarity in that world. The distorted shadows seemed to mock him as the system explained his classification. Those figures represented the unknown that was now part of his destiny. The protagonist, however, continued to deny any responsibility. The terror of his debts and past mistakes prevented him from accepting this new reality. The time for choices ran out. The entities declared that it was too late for names and ordered the forced awakening of individual number 7017. The transition was violent and immediate. The young man felt his consciousness being pulled abruptly, breaking through the darkness of limbo to complete the conversion. He regained consciousness, sitting on a mirrored surface, surrounded by digital data. Confused, he looked at the reflection, trying to confirm his own existence. Something hovering in the air interrupted his thoughts. The boy raised his face, noticing a strange object in that virtual scenario. A small circular robot floated before him. The worker recoiled instinctively, frightened by the sudden appearance of that unknown technology. Recovering from the shock, he pointed at the machine. He realized that this was the source of the voice he had heard during his trial in the dark. The device formally introduced itself as the Yggdrasil system. With a cheerful and mechanical tone, the machine congratulated its new master. The young worker stared at the small robot, completely stunned. He could barely process that. After almost dying, he now had a system serving him. The digital environment began to reconfigure, with blocks of data solidifying to build a new reality around him. The young worker remained sitting on the mirrored floor, watching the small floating sphere. The robot seemed to wait while the system processed the necessary information. A roulette interface appeared, indicating the transformation process. That world demanded more than just physical presence. A complete identity conversion was necessary. Yggdrasil coldly explained the rules of the system. The protagonist understood that, in order to interact with that universe, he would necessarily need to create an avatar and register an account. The boy raised his face, trying to understand the situation. The system, however, ignored his confusion and immediately initiated the next step of the protocol. A holographic window materialized before him, blocking his vision. The system demanded that he enter a name for his new character. The young man hesitated, feeling the pressure of the moment. The silence weighed as he decided what he would be called in this new existence. Suddenly, an intense light exploded around him, forcing him to protect himself. The physical transition began violently, tearing a groan of pain from the boy. When the light dissipated, the protagonist opened one eye. The reflection in his iris no longer showed digital data, but a clear blue sky. He found himself before a colossal landscape, with mountains and islands floating on the horizon. The system announced his official arrival in the World of Phantasm. The wind blew strongly, ruffling his hair. The physical sensation was so real and intense that it left him momentarily stunned. The young man touched his own chest, feeling his heart beat strongly. A smile of relief and excitement appeared on his face as he realized he was alive and whole. However, the moment of amazement was brutally interrupted. He turned around at a noise and came across a group of armed skeletons right behind him. One of the undead attacked without warning. The protagonist recoiled in panic, narrowly escaping the rusty blade that targeted his neck. Without any weapon or preparation to fight, he made the only possible decision. The young man shot off in a desperate flight through the forest, pursued by the horde of monsters. XML. The monster advanced relentlessly, its bones creaking with each step. Even though it was a low-level creature, it posed a deadly danger to anyone completely unarmed. Despair took over. The young man shouted for the system interface to open, seeking any resource that could save him from that pursuit. He pushed his exhausted legs to the limit. The fear of dying right there, soon after arriving in this new world, fueled his frantic escape. The small floating machine kept pace, following him through the forest like a silent witness to his struggle for survival. An opportunity finally arose. The protagonist stretched out his arm, desperately trying to reach the luminous interface that materialized before him. The guide robot seemed to process the chaotic situation, reacting to the urgency of the moment as the system loaded the necessary data. Notifications flooded his vision. The system confirmed the completion of the previous stage and released the pending rewards, including lottery tickets. There was no time to read the details or hesitate. The guy grabbed the digital card that formed in the air, betting everything on that chance. With the undead about to reach him, he mentally begged for a weapon. Any object that could be used for defense would be his salvation at that moment. The intense light solidified in his hand. He felt the firm texture of a handle and tightened his fingers around it, ready for combat. A wave of sudden confidence filled him. With the new equipment in hand, the fugitive decided it was time to stop running and fight back. The blow was struck with all the force accumulated by fear. The improvised weapon collided violently with the enemy, shattering the bones and ending the threat. However, the victory tasted bitter when checking the item. The system mocked him, revealing that his great weapon was just an ordinary toilet brush. The embarrassing silence settled in the clearing. The young man stared at the broken object in his hands as the reality of his terrible luck settled in. Frustration exploded into pure anger. He hurled the useless trash at the floating robot, blaming the guide for the destiny's bad joke. The system continued its cruel mockery. Amidst the mortal danger, it offered him only a useless wig, as if the protagonist's life was a bad joke. The young worker ran desperately through the forest, ignoring the trash that the system materialized around him. He needed a real weapon to survive, not toothbrushes or ice cream. The ground trembled with a brutal impact right behind him. The guy barely avoided being crushed, but the force of the blow made him lose his balance and fall. Cornered and vulnerable on the ground, he saw death approaching. The skeleton raised its blade, ready to deliver the final blow against the defenseless young man. Paralyzing fear tried to dominate him, but the survival instinct screamed louder. A new opportunity arose before his eyes. It was his last chance to turn the tide. In the last second, metal collided with bone. The protagonist summoned a new item, intercepting the deadly attack with a blade that had just materialized. The impact reverberated in his arms, but the blade held firm. The young man felt a momentary relief and a wave of satisfaction as he realized that he now had how to defend himself. The defense quickly turned into attack. Taking advantage of the gap in the enemy's guard, the worker advanced with ferocity, determined to end that threat. With a cry of defiance, he struck a downward blow against the monster, confident that that sword would be enough to destroy his insignificant opponent. The blade hit the target with precision, sinking into the undead structure. The young man expected to see the enemy crumble instantly under his strength. However, the reality was disappointing. The blow was not fatal, and the creature remained standing, barely feeling the damage caused by the superficial attack. The small robot Yggdrasil intervened coldly, explaining that the combat mechanics and life reduction still applied there. The young man cursed the lack of prior warning. The enemy would not give him time for complaints. Recovering from the impact, the skeleton prepared to retaliate with even more violence, mocking the human's failed attempt. The worker retreated, keeping his guard up. He realized that this battle would require more than just a weapon. It would require strategy to survive in that relentless new world. A golden glow appeared on the grass, materializing another item offered by the system. The young worker did not hesitate and attacked, testing the strength of his new blade against the undead. The skeleton retaliated immediately, but the protagonist managed to dodge the deadly blow at the last moment. With the creature momentarily retreated, his attention turned to the opportunity that shone beside him. The interface announced the acquisition of 2 new high-level skills, essential for his survival. The small guide robot watched the scene, confirming that that power now belonged to the guy. However, the enemy gave no respite and advanced again with renewed violence. The parry skill activated by instinct, allowing the young man to block the attack perfectly. Taking advantage of the gap in the monster's defense, he launched a devastating counterattack. The sword mastery amplified the damage, splitting the opponent's bone structure in half. Panting, the worker kept his guard up as the dust from the battle settled. Something unexpected, however, caused his tension to turn into pure shock. He heard the floating guide's words, barely processing the magnitude of his achievement. The robot seemed impressed, as getting a reward of that rank on the first day was unheard of. A maniacal smile of satisfaction took over the protagonist's face. His luck had finally turned around. The young man reached out to the light that materialized before him. The reward for his efforts was finally within his reach. However, the danger was not over yet. Multiple enemies coordinated a simultaneous attack, surrounding the worker from all sides with weapons in hand. He tightened his grip on his weapon. The fear had disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating determination to survive the attack. With a fluid movement, the protagonist unleashed his new strength. The attackers were shattered instantly, unable to resist the devastating blow of his blade. That was the harsh reality of World of Phantasm, a world where power, rarity, and stats dictated who lived and who died. The game, once just a famous title from a major developer that captivated millions, was now his real life. Back in the forest, the last enemy met its end. The undead monster stood no chance against the boy's newly awakened abilities. Silence returned to the clearing. Among the scattered remains of the skeletons, shiny items awaited collection, marking his absolute victory. The young worker caught his breath, feeling the adrenaline subside. The ambush had been sudden, but his enhanced reflexes ensured his safety. He observed the result of the massacre with an analytical gaze. He realized that, in that place, combat efficiency was the secret to rapid growth. The system tallied his achievements immediately. Each kill was converted into experience and points, transforming violence into useful numbers for his evolution. Egon hovered beside him, displaying the battle data. The protagonist analyzed the information on the holographic screen, carefully planning his next steps. As he prepared to move on, the special reward shone brightly beside him. That absurd item demanded his attention once again. A maniacal smile appeared on his face. Disbelief mixed with the euphoria of possessing something so powerful and rare so early in his journey. However, the worker opted for immediate caution. He decided to temporarily seal the item in his inventory, saving his trump card for a more opportune moment. The young worker narrowed his eyes, focused. He realized that the exact moment to act had arrived. A confident smile appeared on his face as he noticed the enemy's position. The plan to lure them was working perfectly. The undead, driven only by the instinct to kill, blindly grouped together. They walked straight into the trap that the protagonist had prepared. Without hesitation, the boy delivered a brutal blow. The blade cut through the air with a speed he had never possessed before. The impact was devastating. The shockwave hit multiple skeletons simultaneously, shattering their defenses in a single movement. An explosion of force swept through the clearing. The attack not only injured, but completely obliterated the threat that surrounded the young man. When the dust settled, the last enemy collapsed. The spoils of battle fell to the ground, shining with the promise of a reward. The worker checked the system interface, curious. After such a display of power, he expected the compensation to be commensurate. The small floating device vibrated with enthusiasm, emitting signals of approval for its master's exceptional performance. The protagonist waited while the system processed the data. That moment of waiting brought the same tension as the gambling games he knew so well. The virtual roulette began to spin internally. The fate of his inventory was being decided by luck at that moment. Icons flashed frantically on the boy's mental screen. The random draw was about to reveal his prizes. The young man stared at the result with a blank look. Expectation suddenly turned into silent confusion. Fury took over him as he read the list. Instead of powerful weapons, the system had given him useless junk, like a toothbrush and a trash can. Grumbling against his own luck, the worker resumed his walk. The little robot followed him, displaying an expression of regret for its owner's frustration. The young man coldly analyzed the outcome of the combat. He realized that the gain efficiency when hunting those monsters was far below expectations. However, he possessed a secret weapon. The protagonist prided himself on knowing the mechanics of that world better than anyone else. He recognized the environment immediately. That initial forest followed exactly the same patterns that he had memorized in the past. This familiarity brought him absolute certainty. The boy knew exactly how to exploit the hidden rules to his advantage. With his goal set, he advanced through the woods. The little robot followed him in silence as he calculated his next step. The pile of bones beneath his feet was proof of his superiority. He had cleared the area and defeated the undead without any difficulty. Suddenly, a holographic interface blocked his vision. The system had an unexpected notification to deliver to the player. The young man's eyes widened in shock. He could hardly believe he was receiving a daily login bonus in this surreal situation. An intense light exploded before him. The prize materialized out of nowhere, emanating a pure and overwhelming energy. The initial surprise turned into pure euphoria. The protagonist smiled, realizing that luck was finally on his side. The item description confirmed his greatest hopes. It was a top-tier weapon, a lethal and rare fusion of blade with firepower. He wielded the new acquisition firmly. That weapon was powerful enough to completely break the game's balance of power. Without wasting time, the boy decided to test the equipment. He assumed a combat stance and prepared a strike against the nearby vegetation. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The massive tree trunk slid slowly, cut in half with frightening ease. The young man observed the blade with deep satisfaction. Combined with his swordsmanship, that destructive power would be unstoppable. The young worker felt the weight of the new power he had just acquired. The satisfaction of possessing something lethal finally replaced his previous anxiety and frustration. He paused a moment to assess the situation in the unknown forest. The small floating guide remained at his side, awaiting the next step of that unpredictable human. The artificial intelligence processed the data in silence, calculating the probabilities of that forced alliance. The protagonist, however, was not interested in blindly obeying. He dictated his own terms, making it clear that he would only collaborate if it was convenient for his goals. The robot expressed its digital frustration with an icon of disdain. The stubbornness and arrogance of his new master were already testing its circuits. Ignoring the system's acidic humor, the boy put on the protective gear that materialized. The armor was basic, but essential for survival in that hostile environment. His decision to ignore the tutorial, however, made the guide vibrate with anger. Skipping the learning was a violation of the safety protocol that the machine did not accept well. The player just smiled mockingly at the other's concern. He had absolute confidence that his previous experience made any introductory lesson irrelevant. Turning his back on the warnings, he continued forward along the trail. The system, forced to accompany its rebellious user, then asked him to choose a name for the record. The young man looked back with disdain. He commented that this world followed predictable and mediocre design patterns, which only increased his arrogance. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed drastically. A colossal shadow loomed before him, blocking the passage with a suffocating and dangerous pressure. The armored entity emanated a lethal energy, focused entirely on the intruder. The threat level had risen far beyond what was expected for an initial area. The system reacted instantly to the danger, generating an emergency mission. The reward for defeating that monstrosity was high and too tempting to ignore. Cold sweat ran down the protagonist's face, but greed spoke louder than fear. Wielding his blade, he prepared for the confrontation. The enemy did not hesitate for a second. With a brutal and quick movement, the giant sword came down, threatening to split the challenger in half with a single blow. The armored giant brought down his sword with overwhelming force, seeking to end the fight in a single devastating blow. To the enemy's surprise, the young worker intercepted the attack. The impact made his arms tremble, but he smiled, excited by the deadly challenge. The collision between the weapons generated a violent shockwave, proving that the boy's new equipment could withstand extreme pressures. Despite the brutal difference in size, the protagonist maintained his position, resisting the Colossus's physical strength with pure tenacity. He slid backward skillfully, creating distance to catch his breath and prepare his next offensive. The crimson blade in his hands pulsed. He knew that this hybrid weapon was the only thing keeping him alive in this battle. The boy sought momentary cover in the scenery, trying to flank the huge living armor to find an opening. Meanwhile, the small robotic guide analyzed the combat data, shocked to realize that his master was ignoring the system's penalties. That defied the logic of the game. The small floating machine could barely process the statistical anomaly it was witnessing. The young man, however, didn't care about rules or numbers. His mind was focused only on taking down the obstacle in front of him. The guardian of the labyrinth raised his sword again, charging a vertical strike capable of splitting the ground in half. Metal collided against metal once more. The protagonist parried the heavy attack with surgical precision, refusing to yield. Taking advantage of the gap in the enemy's posture, he jumped. Instead of brute force, he decided to aim where the armor couldn't protect, the joints. The blow struck the exposed neck violently. The entity let out a distorted roar as the critical damage was finally confirmed. The force of the impact made the mountain of metal recoil, destabilized by the cunning of that human it had underestimated. The young worker planted his feet, bearing the crushing weight of the enemy's attack. His weapon vibrated with the tension of the block. The impact reverberated throughout his body. However, he refused to yield an inch to the brute force. He wasn't just defending. The mechanism of his blade clicked, preparing an explosive response. A point-blank detonation broke the stalemate. The sudden force of the explosion hurled the giant backward. The armored entity lost its balance. For the first time, the colossal creature faltered before the human's resistance. The protagonist didn't hesitate. Seizing the momentary opening, he advanced with lethal speed to end the fight. Adrenaline took over. A confident smile appeared on his face as he realized the gamble had paid off. The monster tried to recover, exuding a threatening aura. The young man, however, maintained his defiant stance, ready for retaliation. He mocked the logic imposed by the system. For an addicted gambler, levels and stats were no guarantee of victory. Determination hardened his expression. It was all or nothing in that last decisive move. The Guardian unleashed a devastating slash capable of splitting the forest. The boy dodged death by a hair's breadth. The giant hand tried to grab him in a desperate gesture. But the enemy's attack had already lost the necessary precision. The worker's blade found its target. The blow pierced the core, silencing the threat that dared to defy the gods. Distorted shadows exploded from the entity's body. The dark energy consumed the giant as it crumbled. The victor slid across the ground, catching his breath. Silence returned to the clearing, marking the end of the battle. The Forest Guardian was designed to be an insurmountable barrier, a final test of desperation. The system's mechanics were absolute. Failure would result in an eternal cycle of rebirth in the village, preventing advancement. However, the young worker defied the programming. He fought certain death with a ferocity that the data did not predict. The monitor registered the lethal damage. According to the rules of the game, the player's existence should have been erased at that instant, but he refused to fall. The protagonist ignored the system's critical alerts, remaining standing through sheer willpower. Taking advantage of the loophole in the combat logic, the young man delivered a final blow that broke the predicted scenario. In the control room, the reality of failure hit the team. A violent slam on the table echoed the person in charge's frustration. The chief scientist lost his composure, demanding to know how a simple miscalculation had ruined the test. He furiously defended his project, insisting that the difficulty was optimized and the error was not his. The executive, however, remained impassive. With a calm movement, he slid an envelope across the table, ending the discussion. The researcher froze. That silent gesture carried a definitive sentence that he did not expect. Fear replaced anger instantly. He realized that his position was as disposable as the players he monitored. Humiliated and trembling, the man returned to his station, forced to swallow his wounded pride. He reactivated the holographic screens. He needed to find the anomaly in that player before it was too late. That's when an icy presence appeared behind him. The real control was never in his hands. The researcher was so immersed in the data that the world around him had disappeared. A sudden movement made him jump out of his chair, his heart racing from the scare. To his relief, it was just Cynthia. She approached naturally, offering a hot drink to calm the nerves of that long workday. Noticing his exaggerated reaction, she promptly apologized. It was not her intention to interrupt the intense focus he maintained on the project. He accepted the coffee, trying to hide his embarrassment as his face warmed. Her presence there brought a comfort that went beyond simple professional camaraderie. Trusting her completely, he decided to share his discovery. With enthusiasm, he presented the documents that detailed the success of the plan he had been secretly developing. Her reaction was a radiant and welcoming smile. At that moment, he felt that he was not alone in that dangerous undertaking. He had an ally. The memory then shifted to a sterile environment, marked by the rhythmic sound of medical equipment. It was the moment that motivated all his risky actions. He visited his mother in the hospital, holding her hand gently. Her fragility contrasted with the unwavering hope he was trying to convey. To his surprise, she woke up lucid. The recognition in her eyes and the sound of her voice brought immediate relief to his heart. In a burst of emotion, she pulled him into a tight hug. That simple gesture was worth all the effort and sacrifice he was making. He allowed himself to relax in that embrace, feeling a momentary peace. For an instant, he believed that everything would be all right, and that the worst was over. However, reality brutally imposed itself. His expression froze as the perception of something terrible invaded that precious memory. The scene transformed into a cold judgment. Distant voices confirmed that his secret activities had been discovered and all the evidence confiscated. Terror took over him. It wasn't just the failure of the plan, it was the sudden understanding of how that information had leaked. The mastermind of the coup revealed himself, exuding arrogance and power. But the real defeat was realizing who was beside the enemy, complicit in that unforgivable betrayal. The executive looked down with pure contempt. The pathetic attempt at defense before him didn't move him in the slightest. The researcher remained motionless, handcuffed, and cornered. He realized too late that there was no escape from that humiliating situation. The betrayal became explicit when the man embraced the accomplice in front of everyone. The shared smile between them cut deeper than any blade. They turned their backs on the defendant, making it clear that ignorance of his own position in the hierarchy was an unforgivable sin. The executive leaned in to whisper the true offense. The creation of that strategy guide was not seen as help, but as intolerable arrogance. With a mocking wave, he offered his sarcastic congratulations as he withdrew. The researcher's fate was sealed. Before the door closed completely, a final sadistic smile confirmed the pleasure he felt in that destruction. The verdict fell heavy and bloody. The sentence was executed without any mercy. Back in reality, the excessive grip on the weapon made the protagonist's hand bleed. The physical pain brought him back from the abyss of memories. The Black Knight rose, imposing and threatening. The dark aura around him indicated that the previous attack had been useless. The young man gritted his teeth. desperately fighting to contain the energy that was trying to crush him. The opponent's strength seemed absurd. The colossal sword descended from the heavens with violence. That blow was not only intended to injure, but to annihilate completely. It was an overwhelming force that could not be avoided or negotiated. The shadow of death covered the entire battlefield. The warrior was dragged backward, using all his weight and technique to avoid being obliterated by the devastating impact. However, on the verge of total destruction, his focus sharpened. He finally saw something beyond fear. The memory of that man echoed in his mind one last time, bringing a forgotten message from the past. The betrayal in his memory merged with the physical pain of the present as the enemy's blow tore his flesh. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the agony to focus solely on the blade that threatened his life. The young man violently braced himself on the ground, refusing to retreat even one more millimeter. In a desperate effort, he intercepted the colossal attack before the weapon split him in half. The impact was devastating, testing the limits of his resistance against the opponent's brute force. As he fought, he felt as if the ghosts of his memories were there, mocking his futile effort. But he endured. The block was perfect, paralyzing the giant weapon in the air and creating a chance. His instinct screamed. He identified the opening in the defense and announced the weak point. The counterattack was immediate and precise, exploiting the fatal flaw in the enemy's guard. The impenetrable defense finally yielded, shattering under the force of the calculated blow. With the danger gone, his legs failed. He fell to his knees, struggling to catch his breath. Silence returned to the devastated clearing. He survived, but the physical cost of victory was high. However, that battle of life and death was just entertainment displayed on a distant monitor. Someone was watching everything closely. The young man's performance was being coldly evaluated by unknown eyes. Meanwhile, in the Linzea Guild offices, the atmosphere changed drastically. The bespectacled officer adjusted his collar, preparing to deal with an unforeseen situation that required absolute seriousness. Everyone's attention was focused on a viral video on Yggtube, where users were incredulously debating an impossible combat feat. On the screen, the protagonist faced the Black Knight. The observers recognized the face, but doubted it was real. They analyzed the peculiar fighting style with the gun blade, trying to identify whether he was a famous player or an unknown. Smell. However, the reaction speed he demonstrated was inexplicable. The fact that this man defeated the Chaos boss alone shocked the analysts. One of the women present, however, remained skeptical. She suggested that it was just a system glitch. The video continued to display the violence of the combat, proving that the warrior surpassed the monster with brute force and precision. The analyst decided to ignore the feat and withdrew, stating that winning using game flaws had no merit. Her colleague, on the other hand, remained paralyzed. The cold sweat on his face indicated that he understood the real gravity of that event. In a more secluded corner of the room, a blond man stared at the ceiling, completely oblivious to the tension around him. Surrounded by company and drinks, he finally noticed the imposing presence blocking his view. The guild officer stared at him sternly, crossing his arms in disapproval of this frivolous attitude. The memory of the Black Knight's defeat lingered in the air, serving as proof of a talent that was underestimated. The officer then confronted the blond man directly, accusing him of being responsible for discarding that player in the past. The blond man drowned his frustration in alcohol, his face twisted with anger. He seemed unable to accept the reality unfolding before him. However, in the present, the executive regained his usual coldness. He adjusted his glasses, hiding any trace of that previous emotional outburst under a mask of indifference. His subordinate waited outside, hesitant about how to proceed. The doubt about the organization's next move hung heavy in the night air. The guild leader remained silent for a moment, calculating the variables. He knew that every decision now could be costly for his reputation. With firm steps, he decided to ignore the immediate concerns. There was an arrogance in his walk, typical of someone who believes they are always in control. The memory of his past haunted him. He deeply despised the choices of the one he considered his foolish and insignificant younger brother. Meanwhile, in the depths of the system, the new player's profile began to be processed. The protagonist's digital identity was being forged. Far away, the young worker wiped the sweat from his face, feeling the adrenaline subside. he realized that he would need to adapt quickly to that level of brutality to survive. The protagonist contemplated the vastness of the unknown world before him. The landscape was grandiose, but he knew that deadly dangers lurked beyond the horizon. A sudden noise caught his attention, breaking the moment of calm. His player instincts remained alert, ready for any new threat. In the distance, a colossal tower pierced the skies at sunset. The imposing structure seemed to silently watch all the beings of that land. The little guide robot questioned the sanity of the young man's recent actions. For the artificial intelligence, that reckless strategy seemed like an open invitation for enemies to kill him. The machine insisted that such behavior was atypical, even by gaming standards. The young man, however, listened to the warnings with an expression of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Fate, however, had already traced a route of inevitable collision. The older brother in the lead of the guild and the renegade younger brother were now positioned as adversaries, and the battlefield would not only be physical, but media-driven. The viral broadcast on Yggdrasil ensured that public attention turned to this new conflict. The young man observed the desert vastness around him, trying to locate himself in that hostile environment that seemed to have no end. The fatigue from the recent battle and the confusion of the teleport weighed on him, requiring a moment to recompose his thoughts. Frustration clenched his fists. He knew he needed to stay focused and determined if he wanted to survive what was to come. Suddenly, his instincts went off. Something in the atmosphere changed drastically, capturing his full attention. The lottery mechanism appeared in his mind, a constant reminder of the random reward system that guided his life now. The system interface appeared floating beside him, interrupting his thoughts with an urgent, audible alert. The materialization process began. The system indicated that digital data was being converted into physical matter in the city. It wasn't monsters this time. The transfer protocol was bringing other participants to the same location as him. The protagonist felt a sudden vertigo and checked his own body, surprised by the sudden change in the reality around him. He quickly interacted with the holographic panel, seeking to confirm the coordinates and understand where he had landed. The arid landscape disappeared instantly, replaced by the familiar and dark interior of an establishment full of machines. The young man realized the cruel irony of fate. The system had returned him exactly to the starting point, the location of his last failed bets. He remained still for a moment, processing the fact that, even in a new world, addiction pursued him even there. However, the solitude was short-lived. The system detected approaching presences and suggested blocking the perimeter immediately. Before he could act, the entrance was breached. Firm and numerous footsteps invaded the premises, indicating that he was no longer alone. XML. The debt collector finally found him. With a cruel smile, the man mocked the fact that the young man was still alive, clearly expecting a different outcome. Surrounded by armed thugs, the protagonist felt his blood run cold. The threat was real, and the enemy's numerical superiority made any direct confrontation suicidal. The gang leader savored the moment of triumph, certain that his prey had nowhere to go and that the collection would be inevitable. Without thinking twice, the boy chose survival. He threw himself through the store window, catching his pursuers completely by surprise with the sudden escape. Instinct screamed louder than reason. The young man ran desperately through the dark streets, questioning his own sanity as he searched for any escape route. However, he wasn't alone in this race. The system interface, manifested as a technological wheel, appeared floating to accompany his frantic path. Precise navigation instructions appeared before him. With no other options, and with the enemies on his heels, the fugitive decided to blindly trust the system's orders. Doubt gnawed at his mind as his legs burned from the effort. He could only hope that this digital voice wasn't guiding him to his own death. Hope crumbled instantly. The path indicated by the system ended abruptly in front of a tall and impassable brick wall. Betrayed and cornered, the boy turned his fury against the small floating guide. Following those instructions seemed to have been the biggest mistake of his life. His pursuers were quick to catch up. The gang blocked the only exit from the alley, declaring with mockery the end of that cat-and-mouse chase. The loan shark could barely contain his laughter at the others' despair. The situation was completely under his control, and he intended to enjoy every second. The young man retreated until he felt the cold wall on his back. The cruel reality of his debt was about to be collected physically, with no chance of negotiation. Fear, however, gave way to pure indignation. He clenched his teeth, internally refusing to accept that this would be his miserable end. It was then that his attention shifted. The robotic guide hovered silently next to a discarded object on the ground, suggesting a last and desperate alternative. Cornered in the alley, the young worker noticed something useful highlighted in the middle of the trash. Without hesitation, he grabbed the discarded wooden sword, desperately preparing for the confrontation. However, upon touching the weapon, a sudden energy ran through his body, instantly sharpening his senses. The gang leader and his henchmen appeared right behind, confident that the hunt was over. The criminal wasted no time and delivered a lethal downward blow with his metal baton. But the protagonist didn't back down. Moved by a newly acquired instinct, he intercepted the attack. The wood collided against the steel with surgical precision, deflecting the enemy's brute force. The impact generated a shockwave so violent that it knocked down the nearby aggressors. The gang members retreated awkwardly, unable to comprehend the sudden display of strength. The young man smiled. He realized that the dynamics of that confrontation had completely changed. The system had automatically activated a high-level sword mastery in response to the danger. Now, wielding the wooden blade with perfect technique, he felt that using those skills was almost like cheating. The confused bandits looked at their fallen comrade, trying to rationalize the cutting sound they heard. The protagonist felt the combat experience flow into his mind the moment he held the weapon. His opponents hesitated, realizing with terror that this was no longer the same defenseless debtor as before. The leader of the aggressors roared orders, inciting his subordinates to attack with everything, trying to regain control of the situation through fear. With a sadistic smile, he boasted, believing that they had finally found a prey valuable enough for that night's effort. The organization's aura, symbolized by the feared black serpent, seemed to fill the environment with an overwhelming and sinister pressure. However, the bandit's confidence disappeared in an instant, replaced by a gasp of shock upon seeing what was before his eyes. Panic took over his face. The sound of breaking bones and the speed of the boy's movements left him completely speechless. Amidst the defeated bodies, the protagonist remained standing, holding the piece of wood as if it were a legendary weapon, ignoring the pleas for mercy. With his face stained with blood and an icy gaze, he displayed the expression of someone who was no longer playing, but rather executing a necessary task. Before him, the system window shone brightly. Sword Mastery, SR Level 3. Activated, guaranteeing an absurd increase in all his combat capabilities. Upon squeezing the handle of the wooden sword, the flow of blue energy enveloped the weapon, bringing a sense of power that he never imagined he possessed. That was a skill conversion on a completely different level, channeling the essence of ancient warriors directly into his body. Unlike a common game, that strength wasn't restricted to a virtual world. The evolution was directly reflected in his presence in the real world. He realized that since he had converted his own body, and not a simple avatar, every gram of power gained in the labyrinth made him a monster in real life. The henchman recoiled, hesitant, as he coldly reminded them of the moment they tried to steal his account creation rights the day before. Driven by despair and hatred, the remaining thugs advanced in a coordinated attack, wielding their baseball bats with full force. But, with a movement almost invisible to the naked eye, a devastating impact ended the charge before they could even react to his new speed. The impact of the block was overwhelming. The brute force of the attack met an insurmountable barrier, reverberating violently through the air. The gang leader's hand gave way instantly. The physical shock made his fingers tremble, unable to maintain a firm grip on the weapon. The criminal recoiled, stunned by the unexpected resistance. Panic began to surface on his face as he realized that his strength was no match for his opponent. In an act of pure desperation, he tried to regain control. The man spun his body violently, launching a wild attack to try to crush the young man. The protagonist, however, moved with surgical precision. He intercepted the furious blow using only the wooden sword, completely nullifying the offense. The system processed the confrontation in real time. The combat skill identified the fatal opening in the enemy's defense, signaling the moment for the counterattack. The boy watched his attacker with absolute coldness. He mocked the man's position, questioning how a boss could be so incapable of avenging his subordinates. The gang leader lost his balance, repelled by the perfect defense. He skidded backward, struggling uselessly to stay on his feet in the face of that overwhelming pressure. The young worker took advantage of the situation immediately. He pressed the weapon against his opponent, restricting his movements and preventing any recovery. The bandit fell to his knees, completely subdued. While keeping the enemy pinned under his weapon, the protagonist asked ironically what was wrong. Cornered and humiliated, the criminal tried one last resort. He shouted in frustration and threw a straight punch, seeking to hit the boy's face. It was a pathetic effort. The protagonist dodged without difficulty and delivered a brutal blow with the wood, hitting the attacker's face squarely. The man collapsed to the ground, defeated. The young worker put the sword over his shoulder, reflecting on how fascinating the feeling of possessing real power was. The leader's face was disfigured by fear and pain. He desperately begged for mercy, asking for the beating to stop. The protagonist, however, was not moved. He just opened his mouth to deliver his final sentence, ignoring the fallen man's pleas. The leader's face was a mask of pure agony. Between broken teeth and blood gushing from his mouth, his scream of horror echoed, while the tremor of humiliation took over his entire body. With a cold and disdainful smile, the young worker raised the makeshift bat above his head. The blue aura pulsed intensely around him as he uttered a sarcastic, "No problem." A close-up on the aggressor's eyes revealed the total collapse of his spirit. The dread was absolute. A late and desperate realization that he had challenged someone who was on a completely different level. The final blow came with devastating force. The trail of the wood cutting through the air drew a deadly arc against the backdrop of the city in the background, sealing the criminal's fate with a deafening impact on the asphalt. Later, in his simple refuge, the boy reflected on what had happened. He knew that retaliation was likely, but his philosophy was clear. Killing was too easy, and he didn't intend to stoop to the level of those worms. Lying down in a relaxed manner, he watched his small technological assistant float in front of him. With the difference in power he had just demonstrated, he was sure that those men would be quiet for a good while. The messy room was the only testimony to his double life. While he rested, the small AI confronted him, reminding him that he had also left a permanent mark on the minds of his enemies. The proof of this was in the mark of mental manipulation that shone on the fallen leader's forehead. A network of blue energy cracked his skin, a side effect of the psychic interference that the protagonist had implanted. The young man calmly explained that this manipulation was not foolproof. It required the victim's mental state to be completely fragmented by fear for the code to take root. In the reflection of his pupil, the digital interface processed the data from the success of the operation. He was reaching a level of control and technical mastery that the world had never seen before. Sitting on the floor of his worn room, the fatigue finally began to take its toll. He let out a heavy sigh, processing the adrenaline of combat and the complexity of the new information that the system was dumping into his mind. He pulled out a small pocket knife, a common tool that now seemed to have a much greater purpose. With a focused look, he prepared to test a theory. If the system could manipulate minds, it could also enhance physical objects. By focusing his energy, the blade was instantly enveloped by a vibrant blue aura. The visual confirmation came as an electric shock. The abilities weren't just digital, they could be infused into raw matter. The test was an absolute success. With a quick movement, he felt the activation of the long-reach ability, realizing that the effective range of his weapon now ignored the physical limitations of the steel, extending through his will. As he admired the destructive potential in his hands, his technological assistant floated in the background, emitting a constant glow. The AI began to reveal a profound truth. The existence of his master was something that the current world was not yet prepared to understand. The young worker smiled wryly, aware of the power reversal that now dictated the situation. He sat calmly at the table, facing the injured criminal who now seemed much less threatening than before. To make his intentions clear, the protagonist began to spin a stiletto between his fingers with disturbing dexterity. The man in the flowered shirt, still recovering from his previous injuries, broke out in a cold sweat as he recognized the imminent danger. In a brusque movement, the boy pointed the blade, testing the reflexes and submission of his former aggressor. Panic took over the thug, who recoiled instinctively, fearing more damage beyond his already broken bones. The memory of the recent violence made the criminal tremble, realizing that his life was in the hands of that unpredictable young man. Satisfied with the effect, the worker put away the weapon and demanded that the man serve as his guide in this new reality. The city stretched around them, an urban landscape marked by chaos and the silent transformation of the world. Suddenly, the protagonist's calm crumbled. He began to scratch himself violently, feeling the withdrawal and anxiety corroding his skin. The accumulated frustration exploded in a desperate scream, revealing the mental instability he was trying to repress. The guide, trying to speed things up and avoid more outbursts, kicked open the entrance gate to the place they were looking for. The criminal pointed to the store's facade with a forced smile, confirming that this was the requested destination. The young worker cautiously opened the door, wary of what he would find, while his companion remained right behind him. Inside the establishment, a mysterious figure waited with his back turned, surrounded by shelves filled with unknown items. The protagonist stares inside with a penetrating and determined look, ignoring the previous discomfort to focus entirely on the encounter that is about to occur. Before them appears an eccentric figure, Shuzuki, the owner of the Shutenku variety store, dressed in ornate traditional attire and various beaded necklaces. Suddenly, a small floating technological device approaches the young man, announcing that it is analyzing his basic information in real time. With an enigmatic smile, Shuzuki reveals eyes that glow with a bluish cybernetic pattern, indicating that he possesses perceptual abilities far beyond human ones. The worker tries to maintain his composure in the face of the technological analysis, questioning the merchant about how the place works and the rules of the exchange. Beside him, the guide who led them there seems visibly tense and intimidated by Shuzuki's aura, sweating profusely as he observes the interaction. Shuzuki sits relaxed on the counter, maintaining his smile as he watches the two visitors in his store full of rare and mysterious items. Without further ado, the protagonist decides to get straight to the point and begins to pull a black bag from his bag, preparing to reveal his merchandise. He holds the package firmly and throws down a challenge, questioning whether Shutenku can really handle the valuable product he brought. Upon opening the package, a reddish and intense light emanates from the contents, reflecting on Shuzuki's face and arousing immediate curiosity in the dealer. Shuzuki, the dealer with almost icy features, widens his eyes as he analyzes the contents through his monocle. The usual confident expression instantly disappears, giving way to genuine shock at the rarity and energy of the item that shines before him. XML. The merchant examined the contents of the bag skeptically. He admitted that, initially, he thought the boy was just someone who got lucky or stole those magic stones. However, the conversation took another turn as he assessed the client. The seller realized that he had underestimated the origin of that merchandise. He began to explain the nature of the labyrinth artifacts. According to his knowledge, the items found there were divided into two main categories. The first consisted of the so-called common items. These were objects that, despite their power, could never be materialized in the real world. They existed only as data within the system, limited to that virtual reality and useless outside of it. The dealer, demonstrating a rare honesty for the black market, advised the young man. He suggested that it would be better to sell that through legitimate channels instead of there. But, when analyzing the purple sphere with his evaluation app, his expression changed. The technology revealed a crucial detail about the boy's identity. The merchant immediately connected the dots. He realized that he was facing the only survivor who defeated that creature thanks to a glitch in the system. Upon hearing this, the injured man who was in the store went into shock. He recognized the protagonist, and fear instantly showed on his face. The young man remained absolutely calm, only glancing sideways at the terrified reaction of that unexpected witness. The panic was uncontrollable. The bandaged man tried to flee desperately, ignoring the pain to escape the boy's presence. The shop owner, however, did not allow the disorder. With a snap of his fingers, he manipulated the environment's data to contain the situation. The protagonist watched the manifestation of digital magic, slightly surprised by the merchant's speed and control. Now aware of who he was dealing with, the seller re-welcomed him with a new tone of respect. He was fascinated to receive the star of that viral video in his establishment. With the tension dissipated and the identity revealed, attention turned to the power contained in the young man's palm. The merchant raised the gleaming sphere, examining its details with fascination. That object possessed a quality that did not go unnoticed by his experienced eyes. A smile of recognition curved the merchant's lips. He knew exactly what he had in his hands and the value that it represented. Without hesitating, the shop owner recited the item's specific code. The protagonist maintained a neutral expression, silently confirming the accuracy of that analysis. The young man opened his arms with a carefree smile. He saw no reason to hide the origin or nature of the merchandise he had brought. The merchant, however, seemed increasingly intrigued. The boy's casual attitude toward such a specific item aroused his curiosity. The protagonist then changed the focus of the conversation. Pointing to his own head, he inquired whether the merchant possessed the type of modification he was looking for. The shop owner sat on the steps, adopting an explanatory tone. He began to describe the nature of those applications and how they artificially altered the user. While touching his own temple, the merchant detailed how the technology worked. It was a direct intervention in the neural and skeletal structure. The young man, however, seemed little interested in the theory. His gaze wandered around the store, focused on finding the physical product he wanted. Standing before a display case, the protagonist was emphatic. He made it clear that the side effects were irrelevant, as long as the item fulfilled its purpose. The merchant tried to argue, evoking the memory of previous users. The search for power at that cost had led many to madness and physical suffering. Despite the warning, the transaction proceeded. The merchant handed over the disc containing the program, realizing that the client would not change his mind. The seller's voice became somber as he narrated the fate of those who had used that. The exchange for pain reduction had resulted in extreme and unbearable sensitivity. The collapse was inevitable and brutal. The merchant described how the bodies and minds of those people succumbed, consumed by their own choice. With the warning finalized, the man calmly cleaned his monocle. He had done his part by warning about the danger. Now the fate was in the buyer's hands. The merchant adjusted his lens, observing the client with an analytical and distrustful look. He stared at the young man from across the counter, assessing the intentions behind that unexpected visit. The protagonist, however, smiled confidently and pointed, making it clear that he knew exactly what he wanted. With surprising audacity, the young man extended his finger and touched the merchant's forehead, invading his personal space. The sudden touch on the mask left the merchant momentarily static, processing the client's insolence. Regaining his composure, the shop owner snapped his fingers, activating his magic to bring the requested item. An old box appeared in the environment. The merchant explained that this stock was composed of discarded and dangerous items. Inside the container lay several versions of data disks, relics of past experiments. The young man picked up the first version without hesitation, but a holographic interface immediately appeared to analyze the object. The system issued a clear warning. That specific disk was useless, a technical failure with no practical value. Even so, the protagonist kept his focus on the object, drawn by the promise of future prediction contained in the data. The merchant questioned the logic of using such an item. Although it amplified abilities, the physical and mental cost was a terrible burden. The young man put his hand to his head, visibly bothered when imagining the pain and stress that the device would cause. He scratched his hair, looking frustrated and indecisive in the face of the risk of using such unstable technology. However, upon examining the disc more closely, a luminous projection activated, revealing that there was still accessible data there. The young man selected another item from the shelf, examining the data disc carefully. He seemed to know exactly what he was looking for among the goods. His expression remained focused. The protagonist had already calculated the risks and benefits of that specific acquisition. Turning to the seller, he announced his final decision. He would take that item too, completing a total of 3 purchases that night. The merchant smiled, finding the situation amusing. This customer was proving to be much more interesting than usual. However, the young man paused for a moment. Something in the shop owner's attitude indicated that the transaction was not yet over. The seller then revealed the truth. He had express orders to test all customers who entered the store looking for modifications. The merchant's gaze fixed on the boy with a manic intensity. He was eager to see how this particular customer would handle the test. Immediately, the system reacted. Holographic authentication windows appeared around the young man, initiating the data verification process. As the program installation began, the merchant seized the opportunity. He decided to ask one last question before the process was complete. The protagonist listened to the question in silence. His eyes showed that he was fully aware of what was about to happen. In response, a confident smile formed on his lips. He felt no fear of the test that had been imposed on him. Suddenly, A massive column of golden energy exploded from the building, illuminating the night city like an ascending tree of light. The shockwave was intense. The impact was strong enough to knock down the merchant, who slid to the ground, exhausted by the pressure of the released power. Even fallen and stunned, the seller began to laugh hysterically. That result was, without a doubt, far beyond what he expected. Amidst the intense glow, the young man raised his hand. The test had been completed, and the power was now within his reach. The crowd around stared with undisguised hostility. These weren't just curious looks. There was a real and collective threat in those men's posture. One blonde individual, in particular, watched with disdain. His eyes conveyed a cold distrust, silently judging the newcomer. Others turned their faces away, but kept their focus on him through the shadows. The resentment in the air was palpable, creating a suffocating atmosphere. In contrast to the general tension, a figure in oriental garb seemed to find the situation amusing. The smile on his face denoted a malicious and misplaced amusement. Ryu walked down the busy street, feeling the weight of those gazes. He quickly understood that the NPC's hatred was justified. The players had treated them like trash for too long. The city stretched out below, surrounded by walls and mountains. It was a vast and fortified setting, seemingly peaceful when viewed from afar. The young man held his ID card firmly. To that world, he was just another number in the system, an outsider marked by the title of player. As his support drone floated beside him, Ryu reflected on the local history. The atrocities committed by the players in the past had left deep scars on the population's trust. The village market was bustling with activity. People in simple clothes circulated among the stalls, maintaining the routine of trade despite the heavy atmosphere. Suddenly, an argument broke out in one of the tents. An angry merchant confronted someone, accusing him of theft, while the other party tried to justify himself out of the desperation of hunger. Ryu ran towards the commotion, drawn by the uproar. Curiosity compelled him to check what was causing so much fuss in the middle of the square. Upon observing the scene, however, a visual detail intrigued him. The young man immediately noticed that the NPC's clothes were completely out of sync with the village's standard style. He consulted his holographic interface while analyzing the environment. The data indicated that the peace of that region had collapsed months ago, altering local behavior. A sudden understanding struck Ryu. The concept of game had completely disappeared, leaving behind a raw reality where the old rules no longer applied. Before him, the faces of the residents seemed to darken, hidden by ominous shadows. The extreme need for survival was forcing that population to migrate, transforming despair into something dark. The small support drone hovered silently in the air, staying alert while processing information from the surrounding environment. The truth about that world was cruel. The former players had treated the inhabitants as mere disposable insects, committing atrocities under the guise that none of it was real. The protagonist felt the weight of that history. As he walked, he clearly perceived the resentment and hostility directed at him simply for being an outsider. Suddenly, the tension in the streets exploded into physical violence. A silver-haired man was brutally beaten and thrown to the ground by a local resident. The aggressor gave no respite. He grabbed the victim by the collar forcefully, completely ignoring the fear stamped on the helpless boy's face. Arrogantly, the man ordered the boy to accompany him immediately. The scene drew frightened glances, but no one dared to intervene against that display of force. While the conflict occurred, the protagonist's system continued operating in the background. The technological wheel spun, analyzing data and item categories. The interface brought up references from other genres and battles, evoking memories of fights against space aliens and science fiction scenarios. Back in the brutal reality of the street, the resident continued to violently shake the silver-haired boy, imposing his will through physical intimidation. The protagonist, however, just let out a bored sigh. He walked past the confusion, deciding to completely ignore the drama unfolding at his feet. Without looking back, he continued his walk. The young man had more urgent priorities than getting involved in local disputes, and his drone followed him faithfully. A satisfied smile curved his lips. Far from being concerned about urban violence, his mind was focused on the reward that awaited him soon. A short time later, he arrived at his destination. The wooden door opened, offering the refuge and privacy he so desired at that moment. Already settled in the inn-room, the young man finally relaxed. Anxiety took over, as the long-awaited time had come to open his random reward box. The floating device activated its holographic projectors. The interface shone in the air, starting the loading process to reveal the hidden prize. The young man analyzed the probability rates displayed on the holographic screen. The chances of getting something valuable were statistically low, but the numbers were there, daring him to try. Even aware of the risks, he smiled confidently. The protagonist decided to ignore the unfavorable statistics and test his luck in the reward system. An intense light filled the inn-room when the drawing process was activated, momentarily blinding the environment. The young man's expression changed instantly. The gleam of expectation in his eyes gave way to a silent and static disbelief at what was happening. An endless list of useless items filled the system log. They were just common, low-level objects like toothbrushes and coupons, piling up like digital trash. The reward materialized physically, turning the clean room into a junkyard. Brooms, buckets, and mannequins piled up in a chaotic and worthless heap. The young man fell to his knees before the mountain of scrap. The weight of failure and wasted resources fell upon him, leaving him paralyzed. Frustration quickly turned into outrage. Trembling with rage, he stared at the pathetic result, feeling cheated by the randomness of the system. Completely losing his composure, the protagonist grabbed the support drone. He shook the small robot violently, venting his fury on the physical interface of the system. Suddenly, something interrupted his fit of rage. His eyes widened as he noticed a different glow emerging from the midst of the chaos. Beams of golden and multicolored light tore through the virtual space. They were the unmistakable signs of supreme ranking rewards descending belatedly upon him. His attitude completely reversed in a split second. With a maniacal smile, the young man began to effusively praise the same system he had cursed moments before. Two bright boxes appeared on the floor, standing out from the trash. One contained an SR-ranked skill, but the other radiated the rare and coveted energy of an SSR item. The protagonist held the bigger prize with reverence, hardly believing what he saw. The rainbow light reflected on his face, confirming that the risky bet had paid off. The box dissolved into particles of light, revealing the skill card inside. The power of intuition was now finally within his reach. The young man examined the device in his hands carefully. Something about the object's condition seemed out of the ordinary. His expression suddenly changed to pure shock. He could hardly believe the flaw that his eyes had just detected. Regaining his composure, he decided to ignore the momentary problem. The adrenaline of obtaining rare items drove him to continue betting his luck on the system. Without hesitating, he turned to the holographic interface on the wall. It was time to activate the mechanism again and see what fate had in store for him. The system responded instantly to his request. A new sword mastery skill of rare rank was added to his repertoire. Rewards continued to appear in sequence. Defensive and quick movement techniques filled his list, drastically increasing his combat potential. The young man analyzed the flow of power with a calculating look. He knew that, with the right combination, he could further optimize those gains. He turned his attention to the control device that was shaking violently. There was a chance to force the system to transform that situation into something even bigger. Suddenly, the machine began to overload under the pressure of the process. The unstable energy caused small explosions, cracking the structure of the equipment. Smoke rose from the object left on the bed. The protagonist watched the result with his hands on his waist, awaiting confirmation of his risky bet. The risk paid off. The interface confirmed that his sword skill had transcended the limits, reaching the maximum possible level. A predatory and confident smile appeared on his face. The power he now possessed was beginning to exceed his most optimistic expectations. However, the spectacle was not over yet. A golden and bright light exploded in the room, announcing the arrival of something extraordinary. The young man shielded his eyes from the blinding glare. A huge mass of energy materialized above him, dominating the small space with its overwhelming presence. When the light finally dissipated, the object landed heavily on the floor. The device was cracked by the impact of the invocation, awaiting the protagonist's final inspection. The young man felt adrenaline course through his body as he took in what had just happened. A confident smile appeared on his face. He couldn't contain his euphoria, raising his arms in triumph under the golden light. The magnitude of that achievement was overwhelming. The released energy was so intense that the equipment couldn't handle it. The system monitor crackled, unable to process the data overload. With the new equipment already adjusted to his body, the protagonist looked back. He was ready to leave. The young man walked towards the exit with renewed determination. The support drone, noticing the sudden change, trembled as it tried to follow its master. The memory of an imposing and shadowy figure came to his mind. He knew exactly who had overcome that challenge in the past. The protagonist stated with conviction that he possessed unique knowledge. He understood that dungeon better than anyone else. The scene changed to the entrance of an ancient cave, covered by dense vegetation. A group of adventurers was already gathered at the location. The group leader, a robust man with an axe, gave instructions to his companions. The protagonist observed the team's dynamics in silence. While the warriors argued, the young man stayed away. His calm posture contrasted with the tension of the other members. Ignoring the others' conversation, he started walking alone. The sudden movement caught the leader's attention, who turned around surprised. Without hesitating, the protagonist advanced directly towards the swirling energy barrier. He declared that he already knew enough to proceed alone. The adventurers were dumbfounded, watching that stranger act so recklessly. They wondered if he had a death wish. The axe warrior remained incredulous, watching the young man's silhouette disappear. The stranger's attitude defied all logic. Already inside the cave, darkness enveloped him. The system confirmed that he had reached his destination, the witch's hideout. The crimson blade, identified by the system as rarest, materialized in the air. The weapon emanated an unstable digital energy, ready to be used. The young man wielded the hybrid weaponry firmly. Displaying a confident smile, he decided it was time to start the offensive. He advanced through the barren terrain of the dungeon. The protagonist knew that the location's structure changed randomly, making any geographical preparation useless. As his steps echoed across the rocky ground, his presence was immediately detected. A hidden observer noticed that another intruder had invaded her domains. In her lair, the witch monitored the young man's progress through a magic sphere. She needed to confirm the invasion and assess the intruder with her own eyes. The sorceress recalled the times of previous challengers. Linful's group, the current record holder, had taken more than 17 hours to complete that challenge. The old woman's expression twisted in displeasure and fury. The audacity of those who dared to disturb her domain seemed to be an unforgivable personal offense. Her claws pressed the surface of the crystal as she accessed the system data. The information revealed detailed statistics of past incursions. She analyzed the huge time gap between the competitors. The difference in skill between first and third place was glaring, demonstrating the difficulty of the location. With her eyes glowing with emerald energy, the witch made a decision. She would maintain relentless surveillance over that new group and their progress. Oblivious to the remote observation, the protagonist stopped and shielded his eyes from the light. His support drone floated beside him as he probed the cave ceiling. The path ahead was a dark and silent passage. Torches of violet flame dimly illuminated the stone walls, suggesting a latent danger. Suddenly, the young man stopped short, visibly surprised. Something unexpected caught his attention, breaking his calm and analytical composure. A system interface materialized before him with urgency. The information displayed on the holographic screen left him stunned and speechless. The system projected the ghostly record of a previous challenger. However, there was no time to analyze, as a massive horde of red eyes emerged from the darkness ahead. The cave environment already made vision and distance perception difficult. To make matters worse, a threat lurked in the darkness above, waiting for the moment to attack. The young man didn't hesitate. He reached for his belt and drew a specific technological device, prepared exactly for that type of situation. With a fluid movement, he hurled the object into the depths of the cave, aiming for the center of the hidden swarm. Immediately, the protagonist covered his ears tightly, preparing for the sonic impact that he knew was imminent. The sonic bomb detonated, exploiting the giant bat's auditory weakness. The young man explained that this was the most effective strategy, as the creatures plummeted around him. The monsters fell from the ceiling, writhing on the ground in agony, completely stunned and vulnerable due to the sensory overload. Without wasting time, a red blade cut through the air. The attack was brutal and decisive, eliminating the threat before it could recover. He began to finish off the fallen monsters methodically. The young man knew that clearing dungeons was a time-consuming task, but he remained focused on the grunt work. Blood splattered violently as he executed the final blows, ensuring that no enemy would rise again. With the massacre over, he resumed his calm posture, observing the path ahead without showing any sign of fatigue. Surrounded by the bodies of the slain bats, the support drone expressed concern, questioning if they weren't lost in that labyrinth. The protagonist looked at the small floating robot, reacting to the doubt raised by his own support unit. However, he was confident. The young man recalled his past as an analyst, where theoretical knowledge was his greatest weapon. Back then, he had traversed that same scenario countless times through virtual simulations. The path was etched in his mind. The drone remained silent, its digital eyes shining steadily as it processed its master's absolute certainty. The young man stopped in the center of the cave, observing the environment illuminated by the purple torches. Something about the layout of that place seemed strangely familiar and repetitive. He narrowed his eyes at the rock formations in front of him. Disbelief took over his mind as he questioned the reality of that scenario. The system confirmed his suspicions through a mark on the stone. He had passed through there 33 times, an exhausting requirement needed to finally unlock the escape route. Without wasting time on frustration, the protagonist began to climb the rocks. The path was finally open, and he knew exactly how to proceed. He looked back for a moment, processing the task he had just completed. The complexity of the challenge was immense. However, he wasn't just wandering blindly. The young man had memorized every point of the labyrinthine map, engraving the entire complex structure in his mind. He continued his descent with cold determination. The feat of memory and persistence he had just accomplished was far beyond the ability of an ordinary player. Even the small support drone seemed impressed by such obstinacy, displaying an emotional reaction on its digital interface. The boy walked towards the darkness of the tunnel, but impatience began to arise. That exploration was taking much longer than he had planned. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed drastically. A dark energy exploded around him, manifesting as tentacles of darkness that caught him by surprise. Shock was immediately etched on his face. That was a dangerous variable that was not included in his calculations and memories of the map. But the initial fright was short-lived. Quickly, the young man regained his composure, focusing his attention on the origin of that murderous aura with a serious look. A distorted and macabre face emerged from the deep shadows. The creature smiled with pure malice, emanating an obvious lethal intent. The protagonist stood firm, holding his weapon as the evil presence spread across the cave floor. The enemy seemed to declare his final sentence. The shadows crawled to his feet, enveloping his boots as if trying to trap him there. The confrontation was inevitable, and he was now in the monster's territory. The young man kept his guard up, sword in hand, while his drone illuminated the darkness of the cave. The environment seemed calm, but his instincts screamed danger. Suddenly, the air shimmered before him. The boy recoiled, surprised, to see a ghostly silhouette materialize out of nowhere, almost colliding with him. The apparition was not friendly. A skeletal and dark hand advanced violently, seeking to tear the intruder's flesh in a deadly attack. With quick reflexes, the protagonist dodged the attack. The dark energy exploded around him, revealing the magical nature of the ambush. He immediately recognized that power. It was death magic, a lethal trap that formed sinister words on the ground with purple flames. The system confirmed the anomaly. The dungeon's specifications had been altered for an unknown reason, transforming the place into an unpredictable terrain. A cold sweat ran down the young man's face. The situation had escalated drastically. This was no longer a simple exploration, but an assassination attempt. He stopped, observing the vastness of the cave. The path ahead seemed distorted, suggesting that the rules of reality in that place were being manipulated. Suddenly, his eyes widened. A sharp perception struck his mind, revealing something that was hidden beneath the surface of that magic. His passive intuition skill had been activated automatically. The system intervened at the critical moment, granting him an unfair advantage over the trap. Far away, The real culprit laughed. An old witch was amused by the situation, commenting on her prey's annoying luck. She watched everything through a crystal ball. The sorceress mocked the boy's attempts, certain that this labyrinth had no end. For her, his fate was sealed. That corridor of stones and shadows would be the young adventurer's eternal prison. However, shock took over the witch. She recoiled, incredulous, as she realized that her surveillance magic was reacting unexpectedly. In the cave, the protagonist turned his face, displaying a mocking smile. He had noticed the magical connection and was now staring directly at his hidden observer. The witch recoiled, visibly shaken to have her surveillance discovered. The magical connection, once unilateral, now seemed like a dangerous two-way street. However, the young man remained motionless in the center of the cursed domain. The marks of death covered the ground around him, but he maintained absolute calm. In the blink of an eye, the protagonist disappeared. His speed was so explosive that it left only a visual trail behind. The sorceress slammed the table in pure frustration. The audacity of that intruder in defying her control infuriated her deeply. Panic began to arise in her eyes. She realized, too late, that something was terribly wrong with the situation. Meanwhile, the young man moved with supernatural agility. He dodged the dark claws sprouting from the ground, treating the deadly trap like a game. Determined to end the game, the witch channeled more power into the sphere. She invoked a destructive magic, screaming for the target to be obliterated. She believed she had finally captured the invader. With a cruel smile, the woman prepared to see the end of that persistent pest. Purple flames erupted violently, consuming the image within the magic vision. The attack seemed to have been direct and fatal. The magic fire burned within the orb, obscuring everything. The sorceress waited anxiously, questioning whether the enemy's persistence had finally ceased. Suddenly, the crystal sphere shattered in an explosion of light. The connection was broken not by her magic, but by a physical impact from the other side. The witch stood paralyzed, staring at the empty space. The sadistic amusement she felt turned to confusion at the sudden loss of her remote view. To her shock, the protagonist burst through the destroyed wall, completely unharmed. He mocked her ability, disappointed with the mediocre attempt to kill him. The young man gestured dismissively, indicating that he had perceived her intentions all along. The psychological trap had failed miserably. The sorceress felt a chill as she was confronted directly. Her expression hardened as she realized that the worm was, in fact, a higher-level threat. The young man reached for the weapon at his waist. The moment to act had arrived, and there was no room for hesitation. With a confident smile, he emerged from the dust of the rubble. The barrier protecting the place had been completely shattered by his triumphant entrance. The witch, surrounded by the gears of her laboratory, stared at the invader. Her safe hideout had been breached in a matter of seconds. Without wasting time, the protagonist advanced against the sorceress, pointing his blade. The power dynamic shifted drastically. The hunter now cornered the prey in her own lair. He immediately recognized that the environment was a minefield of deadly traps. However, the prospect that a misstep would mean the end only increased his sadistic smile. His expression soon became serious and analytical. He needed to maintain total focus to navigate that treacherous terrain without activating the hidden defenses. His eyes scanned the environment with inhuman precision. That keen intuition allowed him to see flaws and gaps that would be invisible to anyone else. The support system materialized in his mind to issue an urgent warning. The sensors confirmed what he already felt. The place was infested with dangerous anomalies. In an instantaneous reflex, the young man lunged forward in an evasive acrobatic maneuver. An explosion of black magic detonated exactly where he had been a split second before. The impact of the activated trap launched debris and purple flames through the air. The surprise attack almost hit his support equipment, instigating chaos in the laboratory. The small drones spun in the air, struggling to stabilize after the shockwave. The witch's voice echoed through the room, condemning the recklessness of that suicidal invasion. While the robotic assistant tried to process the confusing situation and the corrupted data, the protagonist ignored the warnings. He already had another objective in mind. The young man turned, holding a luminous object that he had just captured. Amidst the deadly danger of that lair, he had found exactly what he was looking for. Terror took over the witch's face, her features contorted by shock. She realized too late that the defenses of her sanctuary and its bugs were useless against the perception of that intruder. With a victorious smile, the young man displayed the holographic cube in his hand. That prize justified all the risk of invading enemy territory. The young man watched the technological object floating, aware that everything in that place had an operational limit that would eventually be reached. But theories didn't matter now. He stood his ground in the destroyed room, facing the hooded threat emerging from the shadows before him. The system identified the target immediately, Siriel, the Witch of Solitude. The creature seemed to vibrate with an unstable energy, reacting to the invasion. The sorceress's aura exploded in purple flames. The murderous intent filled the environment, materializing into pure black magic ready to annihilate the intruder. The protagonist sharpened his senses. He perceived the barrage of spells forming and converging rapidly towards his position. He moved at the last second. As the energy beam grazed past, he analyzed the enemy's attack pattern as if it were a programming error to be exploited. The witch decided not to spare resources and manifested a monstrous silhouette behind her. The young man realized that there was no point in prolonging that fight. He tightened his grip around his weapon with full force. The decision was made. He needed to end this with a decisive counterattack. A system window flashed in his mind. He activated Lightning Step, a high-speed ability to overcome the magic defense. The scenery distorted. He crossed the room in the blink of an eye, ignoring gravity to attack from above before the enemy could react. The sorceress tried to raise a barrier with her corrupt magic and gestured in panic, but the speed of the attack caught her completely off guard. Simultaneously, the young man activated his sword mastery, maximizing the damage and proficiency of the next strike through the system. The red blade was bathed in an intense blue aura. He recognized the enemy's resistance, but he already had the final blow prepared. The protagonist brought his arm down violently, channeling all the power of the system into a relentless downward slash. The light of the aura cut through the darkness and hit the witch head-on. The impact was direct, silencing the creature with an expression of shock plastered on her face. The young man advanced with lethal precision, his blade cutting through the creature's dark defenses. The blow was swift, aimed at ending the confrontation immediately. The impact was direct. The monstrosity was hit head-on, its distorted face twisting with the force of the attack that seemed to have been fatal. However, the protagonist hesitated. Something about it seemed wrong. The ease with which the blow connected raised an immediate and unsettling suspicion in his mind. Suddenly, the creature's body exploded into smoke and dark energy. The enemy dissolved into the air, catching the boy off guard and forcing him to retreat. A wave of magical power swept through the environment, throwing him backward. He tried to steady himself, alarmed by the sudden and violent change in the combat atmosphere. From the remaining shadows, the true threat emerged. Siriel revealed a skeletal and terrifying form, emanating an aura of pure malice and corruption. The young man cast an urgent look at his support drone. The situation had escalated drastically, and he needed immediate tactical information. Without giving him time to rest, the Solitude Witch dove into a fierce attack, her extended claws aiming to tear the intruder from top to bottom. The protagonist was forced to launch himself into the void to dodge. Rays of destructive energy exploded violently in the place where he had been fractions of a second before. As he fell, he pushed his senses to their maximum limit. He knew that his survival depended entirely on trusting his intuition to predict the next move. Reacting on pure instinct, he brandished his weapon, releasing a wave of dark energy to try to contain the relentless and swift advance of his opponent. Desperate, the young man shouted to the drone, demanding to know if there was any escape route or method to neutralize that overwhelming threat. The pressure was overwhelming. He gritted his teeth, feeling the reality of the labyrinth begin to fail around him as he struggled to keep his guard up. Then, the system announced the worst-case scenario. An instant death magic trap was activated, manifesting as a lethal bug designed to eliminate any resistance. The witch's hand extended amidst the digital chaos, ready to seal his fate. The world around him fragmented into visual errors, signaling the imminent end. An explosion of corrupted energy swept across the scene. The impact was so violent that it forced the protagonist to retreat to avoid being obliterated. The white-haired creature seemed confused by the boy's words. She tried to understand the strange terminology he used, questioning its origin. While the battle raged, the other adventurers sought shelter behind a low wall. Fear was etched on their faces, aware that they were powerless there. The young man, however, maintained his composure. A confident smile appeared on his face as he wielded his weapon, ready to turn the tables. He launched himself at high speed across the battlefield. Rays of dark energy exploded around him, but he continued advancing relentlessly. The boy knew that the margin for error was non-existent. He slid across the ground, dodging attacks that could kill him with a single touch. The support drone questioned its master's sanity in the face of that risky maneuver. Ignoring the warning, the protagonist prepared his point-blank attack. The witch, determined to end the confrontation, channeled all her power. A massive sphere of cursed energy began to form above her. The concentrated power shone intensely in the entity's eye. The magic was about to be released with full force. Even in the face of the monstrous form and the sphere of destruction, the young man did not hesitate. He ran directly toward the danger, defying death. The enemy unleashed her fury, desiring the end of her opponent. However, soon after firing, exhaustion was visible in her panting expression. The attack failed to stop the advance. The protagonist appeared above the creature, catching her completely off guard with his blade ready for the blow. The boy looked down with satisfaction. He knew that he had overcome her defense and that the decisive moment had arrived. The blow pierced the entity's body with brutal precision. Instead of screaming in pain, the creature expressed relief, as if death were the freedom she so longed for. When the monstrous form dissipated, only silence remained. A hooded figure stood at the entrance to the cave, observed by the drone's sensors. A confident smile appeared on the young man's face. He realized that the decisive moment for the counterattack had arrived. The witch, once imposing, was seized with terror as she noticed the blade descending towards her, realizing the imminent danger too late. The protagonist took advantage of the opening and launched into an aerial attack, ignoring any danger to ensure the blow. He concentrated all his strength and determination into the movement, determined to end the confrontation right there. The sword came down violently, eliciting a scream of despair from the creature as her defense was brutally broken. Simultaneously with the physical attack, he activated his special ability, interacting directly with the digital structure of the environment. The enemy's information appeared instantly. He analyzed the data of the Solitude Witch, evaluating the level and the probabilities of loot with cold calculation. With the tactical data in mind, he faced the dungeon boss, ready to execute the final phase of his plan. Furious and refusing to fall, the entity summoned mystical flames in her hand, ordering the invader to submit to her power. The young man, however, was already expecting the retaliation. He advanced, dodging the magical onslaught with a fluid and precise movement. His blade cut through the air and pierced the enemy magic, hitting the target with a lethal precision that ignored the witch's defenses. His eyes shone with murderous intensity. Nothing would stop him from completing his objective at that moment. The witch's body couldn't withstand the critical damage and began to disintegrate, dissolving into fragments of digital data. The system confirmed the dungeon clear and listed the rewards obtained, but the young man's mind was only focused on the comparison with a previous record. Despite the victory and the rare item in hand, he expressed intense frustration. The time wasted on navigation errors had ruined the perfect result he craved. The device on the young man's wrist emitted a cheerful signal, confirming the end of operations. The digital interface displayed a friendly notification, contrasting with the tension of the previous moment. Upon hearing voices from the entrance, the protagonist realized he was no longer alone. The sound of other people indicated that he had finally reached the exit of the dungeon. Outside, a group of adventurers bitterly lamented their own failure. The frustration was evident, with team members collapsing to the ground after being defeated by the cave. The mood quickly soured and accusations began. The archer pointed fingers, blaming his companions for the disaster, while chaos and discord settled into the demoralized team. The group leader, a robust man, intervened to break up the fight and ask for calm. While he was trying to restore order, the protagonist silently emerged from the shadows of the cave. Ignoring the drama, the young man passed by the adventurers. The leader was trying to preach cooperation to his subordinates without paying due attention to who had just passed by him. Upon noticing the lone boy, the warrior adopted a condescending tone. He assumed that the young man had also failed, mocking the audacity of trying to face that dungeon without a team. The man continued with his sarcastic comments, believing he was giving a moral lesson. For him, that supposed failure would serve as a harsh reality check for the rookie. However, a holographic system notification appeared in the air, interrupting the arrogant speech. The automatic update of the dungeon information caught the leader's eye. The warrior's expression instantly changed from mockery to pure shock. Cold sweat ran down his face as he understood what was projected before his eyes. The updated ranking displayed an absurd new record. The name Ryuki appeared at the top, having completed the dungeon in less than half the time of the previous record, and without affiliation to any group. Disbelief took over everyone present. It was inconceivable that someone had surpassed Linfel's legendary record alone. The young man, however, continued walking, indifferent to the astonishment of others. The surprise soon turned into aggression. In a sudden movement, a member of the group advanced from behind, placing a cold blade against the protagonist's neck. The boy's reaction was instantaneous and precise. Without showing any effort or fear, he intercepted the attack, blocking the aggressor's arm before the blade could hurt him. The rogue, now immobilized but still furious, demanded answers, shouting. Driven by envy and disbelief, she demanded to know the secret behind that impossible achievement. The protagonist maintained his composure, holding his blade firmly. He observed the environment, aware of the growing tension, but without showing any sign of fear. The other adventurers, however, reacted with immediate hostility. The archer and the mage shouted in protest, outraged by the young man's presence or actions. A rogue from the group, overcome with anger, pointed his dagger directly at the protagonist's face. He demanded answers, yelling, trying to intimidate the boy with empty threats. The aggressor didn't wait for an explanation and advanced suddenly. The young man, however, simply slid to the side with his hands in his pockets, dodging the attack with insulting ease. Frustrated, the rogue lunged again with a downward blow. He put all his strength into that movement, desperate to hit the target that seemed untouchable. The protagonist's eyes flashed with an intense red light. He activated a perception skill, anticipating the trajectory of the blade before it even approached. The counterattack was invisible and brutal. A dry impact echoed as the young man neutralized the attack, stopping the opponent instantly. The rogue collapsed to his knees, completely dominated. The protagonist, without even looking back, sheathed his knife and continued walking, ignoring the aggressor's existence. Humiliated and trembling, the man tried to get up, holding his own body. Fury still distorted his face as he prepared to try to attack again. Before the situation worsened, the group leader intervened firmly. He grabbed his companion by the shoulder, ordering him to stop that ridiculous attitude immediately. The leader, however, was shocked. He realized that the young man had not only fought, but manipulated the rules of the system in a way that seemed impossible. The mage and the archer exchanged looks of confusion and disbelief. They were trying to process the explanation that the boy had exploited a flaw in the dungeon to win. The man in the fur coat narrowed his eyes, watching the young man walk away. A feeling of recognition hit him. He was sure he had seen that face before. The memory of a legendary achievement came to the surface. The impossible feat of clearing the Chaos Dark Knight stage in the unknown depths was linked to that boy. The revelation hung silently over the serene landscape. While the mountains and the lake remained still, the identity of a legendary player had just been discovered. The aerial view revealed a dense forest, tinged with vibrant red foliage that marked the hostile territory. Above, the ancient ruins floated defying gravity, composing a mystical and imposing scenario that served as the stage for the challenge. The news about the new record set caused an immediate physical reaction, with the food being crushed by the tension of the moment. The young protagonist, however, was enjoying a quiet break. He consulted the holographic system while his support drone inquired about his motivations. He analyzed the situation involving the Gay-S Guild. That scenario brought back clear memories of the witch's hideout that he had faced previously. XML. While finishing his meal, the young man maintained a calculating and indifferent expression, ignoring the complexity of the challenge ahead. Making a decision, he stood up firmly. The plan was simple. He would start by dealing directly with those 3 specific objectives. Elsewhere in the dungeon, a large group of adventurers fought fiercely against the local creatures amidst the chaos. The blonde leader, wearing blue armor, pointed forward authoritatively, ordering his team to prioritize collecting the spoils of battle. However, something suddenly interrupted his command. He stopped abruptly, his attention diverted by an urgent warning from the system. The image of that floor's brutal threat, a gigantic and grotesque creature, surfaced as a reminder of the danger. The leader's face paled. He seemed unable to process the update he had just received about the state of the dungeon. The notification referred to the dreaded red spider forest. The boss monster of that area had already been completely annihilated. His eyes widened in pure shock and disbelief. The speed and effectiveness of that feat defied any logic known to the guild. The scenery was destroyed and empty. The person responsible for the feat had left only a casual message warning that he had already left due to an unforeseen event. The guild leader was enjoying a moment of leisure in his office, lying comfortably. He watched a holographic screen float over his chest with some disinterest. However, the content displayed on the digital interface soon caught his attention. It was a video recording detailing a specific raid. The relaxed posture disappeared instantly. The man rose on the sofa in an abrupt movement, suddenly interested in what his eyes were seeing. His expression became analytical and calculating. He touched his chin, seriously pondering the implications of that broadcast. The feats displayed were unbelievable. The screen announced that a new time record had been set in the insect dungeon, and the achievements didn't stop there. White Lake had also been subjugated, with a new record registered against the sea monster. Even the dangerous red spider forest had its completion time shattered by that mysterious challenger. Suddenly, the office door burst open, interrupting his analysis. A subordinate invaded the room, bringing urgency with him. The leader turned to the entrance, maintaining his composure, but already anticipating the reason for that sudden interruption. The assistant standing at the door was visibly stunned. She brought information that confirmed the absurdity that was being broadcast. The reality was shocking. Someone had challenged 4 dungeons at once and broken all the records simultaneously, including in the ancient ruins. The recordings revealed a masked fighter moving with lethal precision, using unorthodox combat methods. The mysterious adventurer demonstrated advanced tactics, using the terrain and unknown items to overcome obstacles that would stop anyone else. The assistant watched the images with disbelief, unable to look away from that display of unprecedented skill. That feat was historic. The area had been untouched for 3 months, since the Phantasma group had been completely annihilated there. The networks repeatedly broadcast the images of the mysterious fighter. Commentators debated incredulously how someone could maintain that insane pace of instant kills for the past 3 months. Disbelief spread quickly among the public. Many refused to accept that a human could move that way, insisting that the videos were certainly faked. However, the specialist in front of the screen disagreed. She realized that, to simulate a battle of that magnitude against the area boss, a data analyst of an impossible level would be needed. The woman felt a chill down her spine as she understood the reality. If this was genuine, the hunter community was about to enter a state of absolute uproar. Far from the TV studios, someone monitored all this repercussion in the palm of their hand. The device emitted rhythmic sounds as news about his deeds ran around the world. The young protagonist watched the bright screen in the darkness of his room. He read the theories and accusations with an unreadable expression, aware that he was the center of that storm. He got up and started walking, closely followed by his support drone. The boy declared that he was prepared to deal with the consequences of that sudden exposure. The young man sat down, hunched over under the weight of his thoughts. The drone, noticing the tension, questioned whether he really intended to continue with that risky plan involving his master. The boy remained silent, processing the machine's words. His eyes showed that, despite external doubts, his internal resolution remained unwavering. A painful memory invaded his mind. He remembered the moment he carried that precious burden, willing to sacrifice everything to protect who was important. The memory brought to the surface the shocked faces of the medical team and the observers. The despair and confusion of that day were still fresh in his memory. He recalled the expression of pure astonishment on the face of one of those present. The gravity of the past situation served as fuel for his actions in the present. Back in reality, the protagonist's gaze hardened. He focused again on the immediate objective, pushing aside the distractions of the past to face what was to come. The young man maintained a calm and unpretentious posture. He assured with complete serenity that he was just an insignificant stranger, minimizing his own strength. The analysts, now face to face with him, couldn't hide their disappointment. The boy's common and harmless appearance contrasted brutally with the legend they had imagined. The protagonist made it clear he wasn't looking for sympathy. The opinions of others about his actions were irrelevant to his goals. In front of the camera, he started the broadcast aware of the impact. He knew his words would provoke many of those watching. The reaction on the streets was immediate and hostile. Civilians and hunters ridiculed the audacity of that stranger, questioning his lack of credentials and guild affiliation. However, his gaze remained unwavering. The determination in his eyes showed that he would not back down in the face of public mockery. Authority figures watched in tense silence. The seriousness on the man in the suit's face indicated that the situation could not be ignored. For the elite, the broadcast seemed like a tasteless joke. The blonde hunter watched with disdain, finding it absurd to give a platform to someone he considered social garbage. However, the amusement soon gave way to an analytical coldness. Something in the young man's speech began to bother even the most arrogant. The protagonist paused, clearing his throat. He knew credibility was scarce, and that few would believe his words without proof. Suddenly, his expression hardened. The apathy disappeared, replaced by a fierce intensity that shone through the screen. In official facilities, entire teams stopped to watch. What started as an annoyance was capturing the attention of powerful organizations. The shock was visible. The revelation made by the young man was enough to elicit a reaction of genuine astonishment from those who had previously only mocked. The digital repercussions exploded instantly. The number of views skyrocketed, turning the pronouncement into an uncontrollable viral phenomenon. Meanwhile, in the digital world, a mysterious figure investigated behind the scenes. He noticed that the detailed records had been deliberately erased. Faced with the corrupted data, the investigator analyzed the remaining voice signatures. There were hidden traces that the data cleaning failed to completely eliminate. The man in the white hat came to a disturbing conclusion. He realized that the implications of that discovery involved names that could not be ignored. In the virtual environment, a voice questioned the authority of the small group to make such impactful decisions. The white hat investigator listened to the inquiry in silence, pondering the complexity of the situation. With no intention of prolonging the debate, he announced his immediate withdrawal from that secure connection. His digital figure began to fragment into data, disconnecting from the system and leaving emptiness behind. In the real world, the atmosphere was chaotic, with flashes of cameras firing incessantly at a public figure. The Ratia Corporation representatives waited seated, facing the hostility of an audience that demanded explanations. One of the journalists present wasted no time, pressing with incisive questions and quick notes. The blonde executive felt the pressure increase, but maintained a stern expression in the face of scrutiny. He finally took the floor, preparing to rebut the accusations that tarnished the company's reputation. The focus of the scandal was Ratia's alleged manipulation of Ghost World, regulating items and dungeon clears. The man closed his eyes momentarily, maintaining his composure as the cameras clicked around him. The crowd of reporters recorded everything, eager for any slip-up that would confirm the rumors of corruption. The executive reopened his eyes, coldly calculating each word so as not to further compromise the organization. Internally, he knew that Ratia had already acted, tracking down user Ryu7017's contacts to gain an advantage. With the information about the target secured, his gaze became sharp and dangerous behind the lenses. A broadcast in the background announced severe measures against Ryu7017. The authorities were reacting aggressively to the spread of the rumors. The shop owner commented on how the whole world was stirred up because of him. The protagonist remained at the entrance, aware of the unwanted attention he had attracted. The young man lowered his hood, revealing his face with seriousness. He ignored the comment about his fame, focused only on the reason for his visit. The woman smiled, expressing appreciation for his voice and direct attitude. She seemed amused by the tension of the moment. The subject, however, changed to something technical. The discussion revolved around a specific modification related to the mental system. The protagonist reacted with surprise to what he heard. The woman maintained an enigmatic and satisfied posture while explaining the situation. She indicated that the stock seen previously was all that existed. The available versions were limited, and there would be no common replenishment. That answer irritated the young man, who questioned the situation. The scarcity of the items complicated his immediate plans. The woman's expression changed suddenly, becoming intense. She realized that she needed to offer a deeper alternative. She then questioned whether he wished to negotiate directly with the creator of the modification. The atmosphere seemed to react to the gravity of that proposal. Without waiting for a response, she searched for something stored in her garments. It was an item reserved specifically for that circumstance. Her hand, revealing artificial joints, extended a solitary disc. They had left that to be delivered to whoever came looking for answers. The protagonist examined the object with distrust. The implicit message was clear, but the item's origin demanded caution. Immediately, the support drone projected a beam of light to analyze the disk's digital content. The system identified the item as the mind's eye. It was a powerful tool capable of interfering with vision to extract hidden data. The protagonist carefully examined the white disk he had just received. The drone beside him hovered silently, awaiting confirmation of the item's analysis. Satisfied, he put the object in his backpack, ending the negotiation. The merchant watched him prepare to leave, maintaining an enigmatic smile on her face as the customer walked away. That payment was the result of arduous battles. The young man recalled the boss-level magic stones he collected alone after defeating powerful monsters in the dungeons. The merchant finalized the transaction, making clear the value involved. The heavy sound of the payment indicated that the exchange had been extremely lucrative for both sides. Walking through the night streets, the protagonist calculated his recent earnings. Adding the value of the magic stones to the revenue from his online videos, he realized he had accumulated a small fortune. Suddenly, the support drone projected an urgent alert in front of him. The young man stopped, surprised by the notification about the approach of multiple people at the same time. A hand rose in the crowd, waving vigorously. The casual gesture sought to capture the protagonist's attention in the middle of the street. A man with glasses and a dress shirt appeared, greeting him with enthusiasm. He acted as if they were old friends reuniting after a long time. The young man looked at the drone suspiciously, questioning the situation. He seemed to not immediately recognize the person, or doubted that coincidence. The man quickly shortened the distance and touched the protagonist's shoulder. The sudden physical approach made the drone react with a visual alert signal. The protagonist remained still, maintaining a cold and calculating expression. He did not return the smile, assessing the intention behind that unexpected contact. The newcomer pointed upwards, indicating a specific point in the city. A gigantic and luminous tree shone brightly on the urban horizon. The man with glasses continued to speak, gesturing towards the golden light. He seemed to use the visual landmark to contextualize his approach or evoke a memory. The guy maintained a confident smile and relaxed posture. He seemed to ignore the silent tension that emanated from the protagonist before him. The protagonist felt the weight of the hand on his shoulder, but did not recoil. That encounter on the busy street carried a meaning that he still needed to decipher. The bespectacled stranger kept smiling, although the cold sweat on his face betrayed his nervousness. He tried to maintain the friendly facade before the hooded young man. The protagonist's response was physical and restrained. He clenched his fists so tightly that his nails pierced the palm of his hand, holding back the violent impulse that arose. Ignoring the palpable tension, the man indicated a specific direction. He insisted that they walk together, guiding the young man away from the main street as if they were old friends. He put his arm around the protagonist with a forced familiarity. As they walked, however, the street seemed to hide attentive and vigilant eyes on every corner. The intuition of danger was confirmed above them. On top of the buildings, armed men waited in silence, positioning themselves strategically for an ambush. The guide tried to keep the conversation natural, seeking confirmation that the young man was following him willingly. The protagonist agreed calmly, without raising his head. However, the young man was not being fooled. A dangerous smile appeared under his hood as he realized exactly how many enemies awaited him in the shadows.